In this video, I'm going to show how to import a list of church attendees stored in a spreadsheet into a Jethro online church management system. Jethro is a CSV importer for this purpose, but it requires the CSV in a particular format. We're going to use an open source utility called OpenRefine to progressively transform our spreadsheet data into the format Jethro wants. This data is fake, but the form is from a real situation. Jethro CSV importer is available under Admin Import. And the first thing you'll notice is that it needs a group to put people into. So let's just add a group called Import. You'll also need congregations defined in Jethro, and I've already got a Sunday 9 a.m. and a Wednesday communion service defined. When beginning a Jethro CSV import, it's a good idea to look at the sample file. That's because this sample file is dynamically generated based on the custom fields defined in your Jethro. We can now compare what we've got with the format Jethro wants. For instance, we're going to map surname to family name and last name, and so forth. Now we could just feed this spreadsheet straight into OpenRefine. But I found that it is a good idea to first save the data as CSV and clean it up as much as possible before feeding it into OpenRefine. So we are going to save this with a .csv extension, and we're going to delete any extra rows. And I think there's a column we don't want either. By doing this, you speed up the import in OpenRefine, and you also save yourself from having to deal with numbers and data types. Everything is now just a text string. Particularly, these numbers are text in here. You don't have to convert them from numbers to strings. So let's import our CSV. Feed it to OpenRefine. It takes a look and it notices that the first row was our title here, whereas we want it to interpret those as the column headings. So you can go in first row, ignore first line, and pass the second line as the titles. So that's correct. We can now begin manipulating our data. We're going to go column by column. So starting with family name, we said we were going to map surname to that. We just need to do a rename now. So I'm going to go rename this column. Also, our surnames here are all capitalized, which we probably don't want. So what we can do is go Edit Cells, Common Transforms to Title Case. Moving on to last name, we're going to just duplicate the family name column into last name. So we go add columns based on this column, call it last name, and the value will just be the value of the original family name. Now, it's not true in general that every person in a family, which is just a bunch of people who live in the same place, will have the same last name. So this data might need cleaning up later, but for now we'll just go with that. Moving on to first name, we just need to rename this column. For congregation, we have a service column here, but the data is quite incomplete and messy. We can use an OpenRefine feature called Facets to see what's in there. And by clicking on one of the values, you can restrict the rows to rows with just that value. I'm doing this just so that I can see what possible values we need to map to our two real congregations. So I'm just going to take a screenshot of those values, store it temporarily down here, just for my future reference. We can now close that facet and begin to transform this column. So we go Edit Cells, Transform. We've now got a choice of programming language, and I'm going to use Python because it's neat, it's cleaner for multi-line code snippets. I'm going to define variables for our two congregations, and now I'm going to do a big if then else clause to handle each possible combination. And I'll put everyone who isn't explicitly mentioned into congregation 1. Now obviously you could clean this up more. You could, if you wanted to, use regular expressions and then do a re.match on text to classify it. But for this demo, that's good enough. And we also need to rename service to congregation. Moving on to status. We don't have a column for status, so I'm going to create a new one, just populated with the word core. I would have expected in OpenRefine there to be an add column button, but there isn't for some reason. What you have to do is take any column and go add column based on this column, and then rather than use the value, you just put a blank, or in this case, the word core. On to gender. Gender isn't a required field in Jethro. I'm going to use this as an opportunity to show a neat feature of OpenRefine. What we're going to do is we're going to take the first name and we're going to infer the person's probable gender based on that using an online API. So we go edit column, add column by fetching URLs. Now the service we're going to use is called genderize.io, and the format is you just give it a name and it returns a JSON snippet with the gender and the probability. So each output here, OpenRefine is going to fetch and return the JSON. So I'm going to call this column gender JSON. And let's reduce the throttle delay so it's a bit faster. If you have lots of data and you don't want to apply an operation to all of them at once, you could select some stars, create a facet on the star, and then apply the operation to just that facet. Now we're going to derive a new column called gender, whose value is going to be the parsed JSON, and then we're going to extract the gender field from that. And finally, we can delete this JSON column. Moving on to age brackets. This is a required field in Jethro. If you go to system configuration, you can see the age brackets. We're just going to assume that everyone is an adult for this demo. So again, there is no column. Let's derive a new one called age bracket, and the value will just be adult. Moving on to email, we have an email field. We just need to rename it because this is case sensitive. Mobile tel, here's the mobile numbers. There is a problem here. You'll notice that mobile numbers in Australia anyway begin with a 0. Now these numbers don't, because at some point this data has been loaded into Excel with this column marked as numeric, and Excel has removed the leading 0 because it's unnecessary for numbers, but it is necessary for mobile numbers. So what we're going to do is transform this column to re-add the leading 0. and we can just do 0 plus. Moving on to work tell, we don't have that column here, so I'm going to add a new column with blank values. For home tell, we just need to rename this column. Onto address street, we just need to rename this column. Address suburb, let's map town to that. Address state, we don't have a state column here, so let's add it. By returning, let's put everyone in New South Wales. Address postcode, we do have a postcode, we just need to rename. Notes, I think we did have a notes column, yes, so we just need to rename it. And if we wanted to, we could add columns for group, which would add these people into a new Jethro group. Now to deal with this PO Box column, Jethro doesn't track PO Box natively in user records, so we do want to track that information. So I'm going to add a custom field called PO Box to store that. And now if we were to look at the CSV sample file, you would notice that there is a new column for PO Box right at the end, or near the end. Where is it? PO _box. So let's rename our PO Box column to PO _box. Also, we forgot to rename mobile to mobile _tell. That data looks good. We'll export it to CSV and see what Jethro does with it. So we go to export, comma separated value. We go to Jethro, admin, import, drag the CSV over, pick the group and go. So Jethro is saying that it's not happy with the last name field being blank in some of our rows. What's happened is that in the data we assume that people with a blank, at least rows with a blank family name, belong to the family of the previous filled in value. And that's Jethro's CSV import is happy with that for family name, but not for last name. So we could have a look at the extent of the problem with a text facet and just filter on blank rows. Or rather, OpenRefine has this concept of records. It also understands that rows with a blank initial column kind of may belong to the preceding one that isn't blank, which is quite handy because that gives us an avenue to fix this. Under Edit Cells Transform, there is a variable called record, and this gives us the record, the group of rows that we're dealing with. Then we can go cells and find our last name cell and get the value, in fact the first value, and that gives us the value of our initial row in the record. I didn't invent all that myself. I found that by looking at the documentation here. Record. So anyway, we're going to apply that transformation and clear our facet, and that fixed the problem, I hope. Let's try again. Okay, on to the next problem, which is that we have this, firstly it's an invalid phone number, and secondly there are two of them, which suggests we might have a duplicate row. So in the data, in the mobile tel column, we can check for duplicates by doing a duplicate facets check and look for duplicate facets that are true. So ignoring the blank ones, we see that these two rows have the same mobile tel number. They look to be distinct users, and I don't know which one is correct. So I'm going to add a note to, actually forget that, I don't know which is correct. I'm just going to delete them. So delete all that value from all identical cells. Okay, turn off that facet and try again. And there we go, it's finally succeeded. So we get a preview of what the CSV import will do. We say yes, and now we have got a populated Jethro instance. One further thing I'd like to show in OpenRefine is its undo-redo history. So as you make transformations, OpenRefine is storing them in a stack here, and by clicking on these you can go backwards in time all the way up to the initial state. Now I would have hoped that you could edit these transformations as well, for instance if you made a mistake, but unfortunately you can't. If you make a mistake, all you can do, for instance say that this transformation was incorrect for some reason, all we could do is go back to the state prior to that and redo the transformation. Now another thing with this history is that we can extract a textual representation of those transformations. So we can select, so they're all selected by default. We can copy the text of those transforms, and then, for instance, say that the CSV was not in its final form. Say your parser gives you an updated version of the transforms with different names. You could now go back to OpenRefine and create a new project, choose the updated CSV, do the initial load, and you can now apply the text of those transforms, and all the transformations are being reapplied to the new data. You could also, because it's text, you can edit it, and that's quite handy sometimes to edit a transform that you've done in the past and then reapply it. So I hope you found that useful. Thanks for watching.